Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur. One of the biggest challenges for Mexico's new government will be how to confront Donald Trump's offensive against immigrants in the United States. This offensive affects the daily lives of millions of Mexicans who are living in the United States, but it also affects Mexican policy with the pressure on Mexico to block the entry of Central Americans from its southern border. With immigration at the front and center of the binational relationship, what can we expect in this new era? These are tough issues, and that's why I'm really glad to have with us today Susan Gzesh. Susan Gzesh is a lawyer and the director of the Pozen Center for Human Rights at the University of Chicago. Thanks so much, Susan, for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
She's a longtime expert on immigration issues and issues affecting the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Susan, I want to start with a question that has come up frequently here, and that is whether what we're seeing in the United States today is really a change or if it's kind of more the same. People often mention the true fact that Obama deported large numbers of Mexicans and other immigrants from the United States. But then we're seeing these signs, more than signs, direct statements that the Trump vision goes deeper than that. How do you see what's happening with immigration in the United States today?
Well, the changes are both qualitative and quantitative. The Trump administration has stripped any sense of humanitarianism from its way of dealing with immigrants. So for the Obama administration, yes, they were deporting large numbers of people, but they also did it based on priorities. And both the arresting authorities and immigration judges would have the authority, if they met someone who was a grandmother who's been in the U.S. for 10 years, she's helping her permanent resident kids take care of her U.S. citizen grandchildren, no criminal record, that person would probably not be arrested. But if they were arrested and brought before an immigration judge in the Obama years, the judges had the authority to terminate the deportation hearing. So the Trump administration has both taken away any sense of priorities of going first after people with criminal records. In fact, yesterday, as I told you before, I saw a news bulletin that said that the number of immigrants who have been deported, who have no criminal record whatsoever, has tripled under Trump compared to the Obama administration. And also, Attorney General Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, and I like to say his whole name because it tells you what his background and understanding is, has terminated the ability of immigration judges to dismiss a deportation hearing against someone. In other words, immigration judges used to have the discretion to just end the proceedings if they thought there were strong equities. No, it's a waste of time to try to deport this person because for various humanitarian reasons, they could dismiss the hearing. But they are not real judges. Immigration judges are employees of the Department of Justice. They're not federal court judges. So they're totally subject to the whims of the Attorney General. And a couple of months ago, Sessions said, no, you no longer have the power to terminate proceedings. So pieces of the deportation machine where discretion could have been exercised favorably to let someone stay in the U.S. are now gone. And
so we're looking at a completely punitive model.
Exactly.
And not against individuals, but as immigrants as a class.
Right, and also with this label of zero tolerance, which means that nothing is forgiven. Every law enforcement officer exercises discretion, right? There really is no such thing as zero tolerance. If police in a car are driving to a bank robbery and they see somebody jaywalking, they're not going to stop to arrest the person jaywalking. So having zero tolerance doesn't even make sense in law enforcement terms. In other words, they're not dealing with the most serious cases. They're just treating everything equally, which is nonsense and intended to generate an atmosphere of fear among everybody.
Fear has been a big part of this because there's, in addition to what they're actually doing, there's all this rhetoric all the time. There's the tweets and there's the speeches and there's the vilification of Mexicans as a whole, which has caused so much animosity and tension in the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, there's even, you know, the subjective is just out of control, that people are afraid. And there's also been, as we know, a certain amount of balkanization in the United States. In the sanctuary cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, undocumented immigrants, Latin Americans, Africans are not afraid of being on the street. But in places where Trump's administration has deputized local police to also be the eyes and ears of immigration enforcement, any person of color, particularly Latinos, Africans, people from the Middle East, are just afraid that any encounter with law enforcement could really be a problem. I have friends who are academics, who are Latin Americans, who were driving to North Carolina from Chicago, and they were very worried about some of the states they were going to cross. Just that if there was a traffic violation, you know, you're going 60 in a 55-mile-an-hour zone, would they have a much more complicated interaction with law enforcement based on this atmosphere of racism and fear?
And that's where this issue of priorities in zero tolerance comes into, because there actually have been local law enforcement authorities who have said, we don't want to take on the job of immigration enforcement. We're here to stop crime.
Right.
And things that really, you know, violent crimes that really do affect a community, as opposed to a neighbor not having papers, who's working, paying taxes, has lived there for maybe 10 years.
Right. It also makes immigrant communities themselves more dangerous, this zero tolerance, because we don't want immigrants to be afraid to go to the police if they are victims of or witnesses to crimes. And if they know the local police are likely to be suspicious of any foreign person, they're less likely to report crime, which means more impunity for crimes in general. So cities like Chicago are defending their right to refuse to cooperate with the deputization of local law enforcement. There are cases in court both in California, the whole state of California, the state of Illinois has passed legislation, the city of Chicago is litigating. So the places which are more immigrant friendly, or they call themselves welcoming states, see everyone in their communities as members of the community who are entitled to the same sorts of police enforcement of ordinary criminal laws as anybody else.
So it's making the immigrant communities there more vulnerable, and that makes communities in general more vulnerable, because a community by definition means everyone working together to keep things functioning and peaceful,
right,
as possible. Yeah, we're really seeing that kind of breakdown. There's been a lot of protests here in Mexico as well about the issue of family separation. Not just as a violation of rights in the abstract, but because with so many people who have relatives in the United States, it's shocking to think what it means to have families separated like that. And it's become, in some ways, the hallmark of the Trump administration immigration practices. Now that it's been pulled back a little, what do you think the upshot's going to be of that whole scandal?
Well, they still haven't been able to reunite all the children taken away, and their statements that some of the parents wanted to go be deported without their kids and leave the kids in the U.S. You know, there are civil society organizations and journalists who are doing interviews of people who have been deported, and it's just not true. It's like, you know, who would voluntarily give up their kid? But another thing to understand about what's going on in the U.S. is that it's not that there are, I mean, yes, in the case of people coming across the border with their kids, the whole family's undocumented and very vulnerable. But families there's so many mixed families as well. Families where the kids are U.S. citizens, the parents are undocumented. Or one parent might be a permanent resident, but the waiting list to get their spouse permanent residence is so long, you know, so there's the activities, these zero tolerance activities touch on so many different families. Plus the DACA kids, who are now, the most recent court decision has said that the administration did not have the authority to end DACA, so maybe they'll be saved again from imminent deportation. Also, all of the families who have been impacted by temporary protected status, a status that people from El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras have had for so many years, and now they want to just take it away with the stroke of a pen. Those are mixed families. We're talking about families that have people who are legally in the U.S., people who are on their way to get legal status, and people who are undocumented. So this whole notion that conservative Republicans were pro-family, you can just throw out the window right now in terms of the policies that they actually enact.
Yeah, there's nothing more tragic than to see those images of children being taken away from their parents. And then there's that whole invisible part you talk about where families that have been separated by this situation for a long time. There's been a lot of criticism of the Peña Nieto government and governments before that about the way that they handled or didn't this situation, this offensive against immigrants in the United States, especially in terms of not having a more proactive defense of their rights. What can a Mexican government do in this context where the United States government, especially Trump, has so clearly said immigration is our domestic and also national security issue, that despite the fact that these families are transnational, that these issues are transnational, basically has nothing to do with Mexico in terms of having input?
Well, Mexico has done, I mean, the consular staff in many places are really valiant, participants. They have the attitude of social workers. They try to save people and save them from harm. But whether they have resources, whether they have the real capacity to do anything, varies from administration to administration. Right now here in Mexico, there's like a scandal in the Mexican Senate, I know, has investigated the dispersal of, it's either 50 million pesos, is the article in Proceso, or $50 million that the Peña Nieto administration announced they were going to give to the consulates in the United States after Trump was inaugurated to defend Mexicans. Nobody knows what happened to the money.
I remember that announcement.
There were in prior administrations much more focused and concentrated programs. To fully admit, my law firm participated in a project where we were able to defend the rights of Mexican workers, particularly in the temporary worker programs, supported by the network of Mexican consulates across the United States. Our Chicago-based firm did a case in Idaho, we did cases in California, we did cases in Louisiana, which were supported by the Mexican government. And when we won the cases, we were able to give attorneys' fees back to the Mexican government. And then the Mexican government has also worked with the networks of civil society organizations in the U.S., such as the ACLU, National Immigrant Justice Center, et cetera, to use the consular eyes and ears, because they're in 52 different cities, to help the U.S.-based networks keep track of what's going on with Mexicans. So there are good models from the past. I cannot say that Peña Nieto's administration has been a very good model of what can be done.
You wrote a letter that was published in La Jornada with Jesus Garcia, a prominent Chicano Mexican-American politician, with some recommendations, an open letter to Andrés Manuel López Obrador. What are some of the issues that you're seeing there to start in with for the new government?
Well, Jesus Garcia is a county commissioner in Chicago and will be in November, because it's Chicago and Democrats always win, elected to Congress from the southwest side of Chicago, from the Latino community. And we wrote a letter just to sort of get out there this discussion. And we said, for example, as we know, Mexico is under tremendous pressure to be the filter for Central Americans from the United States. There are rumors this week that the Peña Nieto and Trump administrations want to conclude what's called a safe third country agreement to say that Central Americans who come through Mexico can't apply for political asylum in the United States, that they'll have to stay in Mexico. And it's a practical matter that's happening at the border already. When a Central American family goes up to a border station and says, we want to apply for asylum, they're made to wait in Mexico. They just want to formalize this and do it on a much larger scale. Well, I don't think Mexico wants to become to the United States what Turkey is to the EU, where Turkey has been basically told, well, we'll give you 6 billion euros if you will stop all the Syrians from getting to the EU to apply for asylum. I don't think Mexico wants to be the U.S.'s extended border.
There's been some confusion about that issue here in Mexico, because some groups are saying, well, we should be providing asylum to refugees.
I think
obviously we should be. But what we're talking about here is preventing them from going to the United States, where in fact they may have family and other ties that would make that a much more logical country of asylum for them.
Yeah, and there is an existing U.S.-Canada Safe Third Country Agreement, and it has an exception. If you have family who are already in the other country, that's where you should be able to apply for asylum. And of course, I think the course for the incoming presidential administration in Mexico would be to try to improve due process and guarantees to this extremely vulnerable population here, but not agreeing to be the U.S.'s Turkey.
Not eliminating the possibility of people who choose to do so
to have a safe
requesting asylum
passage through
in the United States.
The other thing we were trying to alert the new government to, is this question of whether the expansion of organized guest worker programs will be something that the Trump administration would put on the table in return either for Mexico blocking the Central Americans or for some other sorts of concessions, perhaps within the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement. And I think that AMLO's administration would need to take an extremely careful look at the current and past experience of people who come in guest worker programs to the U.S. Yes, crossing the border safer because you're coming with permission, but the repeated instances of abuse, taking passports, one U.S. NGO called it conditions close to slavery, the experience of advocates on both sides of the border dealing with the promises made, the promises broken, the atrocious conditions. I mean, I can tell you about a group of women in Louisiana who my firm represented who were really in slave-like conditions, Mexican women working in seafood processing.
And they have a lack of exercisable labor rights because they can just lose their job.
Exactly. Their right to be in the U.S. We would like visa portability and liability for promises made by recruiters.
Visa portability means you can move from one job to another.
Yeah, and they could even do it by sector. They could say if you're in seafood processing, you have to stay in seafood processing. Or if you're in, working grooming ski slopes or something, or picking Christmas trees, you have to stay in those sectors. But at least to give the workers more agency in terms of being able to move if the conditions are intolerable.
That's another thing that people are worried about, that there could be these kinds of negotiations, and that the United States has a lot of leverage in these negotiations because of the degree of economic dependency that Mexico has with the United States. And we see this very specifically when these issues become negotiable and human rights of people become negotiable in the context of the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. How can civil society organize on both sides of the border to press for a policy that's human rights organized, that's human rights oriented, instead of becoming this political negotiation of I'll give you this and you give me that?
Well, I don't think the NGOs in the United States have any weight with the incoming presidential administration here in Mexico. I think that this incoming administration wants to listen to people in Mexico and hopefully to Mexicans who live in the U.S. So a careful examination of the prior experience with guest worker programs, with separation of families, I think if officials are going to say, okay, we will agree that there can be an expansion of guest worker programs, which have been on the table for years, they need to go back to the Bracero program, to before, to really understand what the experience has been, because Mexico can place conditions on people coming to the United States. That they want a certain transparency in terms of the contracts, that they want full labor rights guaranteed, that there's access available to people in these situations, et cetera. So I think there are sets of conditions that Mexico would be well within its rights and well within its standard as a negotiating party to what is supposed to be a bilateral agreement. But, we know there's an old saying back from the Porfiriato, right? Mexico's so close to the United States and so far from God. It's a very delicate relationship, but the presence of such an interdependency, like in the auto industry, right? Manufacturing is completely integrated between the U.S. and Mexico. An understanding of the subtleties of the relationship, both in economic terms and trade terms, and in the movement of labor between the two countries, I think is needed. And there's no reason to rush.
Yeah.
There's no reason to rush to set up a new guest worker program. Yes, they're putting a lot of pressure on the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, but I don't think they should rush. I think this stuff needs to be thought through with input from people whose lives, experience, and expertise can give information to AMLO before they make the decisions.
That's a good point. Right now, you see a lot of organizations here in Mexico that have worked for years in rights that have developed a set of recommendations, really scurrying to try to figure out how to get those recommendations in and what needs to be changed and how it needs to be changed. And it's a complicated process, and it's also a complicated process because there's this recognition that the United States is the silent figure in the room in terms of how far you can go. And there's also a lack of knowledge of how the new government will be organized to change some of these things. In terms of rushing or not rushing, though, there does seem to be a real urgency regarding the rights of Central American migrants and the safety of Central American migrants here in Mexico, and the rights of Mexican migrants in the United States.
No, places where people are getting hurt need to be dealt with immediately. And I'm not sure the Congress comes in before, the new Congress comes in before the executive. So whether there can be activity done by the new Mexican Congress to try to mandate some approaches or allocation of resources that could help people being returned, that could help people waiting at the border, while they're waiting for an executive to executive agreement, I'm not sure how that can work. It's not the situation we have in the U.S. since both come in at the same time.
Yeah, it's a little bit unusual there, and it'd be interesting to see how it works. Although we're still talking about the same correlation of forces in terms of the president's party.
I mean, maybe one of the things the Mexican Congress could do, and here I'm violating what's that article of the Mexican Constitution, that foreigners are not supposed to intervene in Mexican politics.
I think experts can opine.
Okay. That I'm not a carpetbagger, I'm just an academic. Is that perhaps the new Mexican Congress can hold hearings on some of these issues in the couple of months before the new executive comes in, to start to lay out what some of the complicated factors are in terms of how policy has been made in the U.S., what Mexico might do to intervene, whether it's the labor rights of Mexican migrants, the conditions if new guest workers are going to go, the Central Americans in Mexico, et cetera. I mean, maybe that's a way that kind of staggered coming into power could work, that the new Congress can prepare the way for some initiatives by the executive.
Yeah, basically a consulting process. Along the same lines, years back you were involved in the formation of a regional network on immigration. And I remember when Trump first came into office, I was speaking with a group of Central Americans and Mexicans and said, look, this administration is going to be about borders and business. And there was a recognition, but there wasn't a lot of resonance with that because we tend to be so entrenched in our own national politics and short-sighted when it comes to creating more transnational, transborder issues. At the same time, it's like we said, our very own families are in this condition. You know, are there any keys or lessons learned about how to construct those, especially now as we see this critical moment in both the threat that's coming from the United States and the possibility perhaps that's coming from Mexico? Yeah,
I mean, there are some organizations that are by their very nature already transnational. So Alianza America is based in Chicago, which is a coalition of Latin American-led immigrant organizations in the U.S. who also are active in their countries of origin. And right now they have a delegation which includes U.S. elected officials in Honduras, seeing what the conditions are in Honduras. And in the process of the negotiations of civil society with the United Nations, looking at the new possible global compact on migration, there are more relationships set up between U.S.-based and Mexico and Central American-based organizations. And the organization we formed almost 20 years ago, the Regional Network of Civil Organizations for Migration, still functions within the context of what's called the Regional Conference on Migration, which is when all the governments from Panama to Canada get together on an annual basis to talk about migration. So the forms are there. It might be that they need a renewal of energy. They need some of the young people to come into them more. And of course, there's a need for more cross-border discussion. It's amazing to me, for example, I can talk to lawyers in Mexico who are very worried, for example, about these mysterious lists which bar people from migrating, these alerts. And they tell me they're working on that here. And then I said, well, the ACLU is doing the same thing in the United States, and they've never talked. So the more cross-border discussion that can take place where issues are very parallel. And understanding
and just information sharing.
Is critically important. So that's, that's kind of what we're trying to do, is foment more cross-border discussions, more visits back and forth, so that strategies and tactics can be coordinated on both sides of the border, whether it's just getting information from human rights organizations in Mexico for Mexicans applying for asylum in the United States based on the activities of criminal cartels, or whether it's information about how Central Americans are treated going through Mexico so that an immigration judge won't say to them in the US, well, you could have applied for asylum in Mexico, why didn't you? I see it from the American lawyer's point of view because I want help for people making applications to stay in the US, but there are lots of other ways in which more cross-border discussion is very useful.
Without a doubt. On the broader level, we've talked about some specifics in terms of policies. We talked about the letter that López Obrador sent to Trump, that Trump sent to López Obrador before the delegation came down, which was very friendly. We saw an unusual or unexpected, perhaps, rapport between the two presidents. And there's some people who feel that that's in some way a betrayal of the Mexican people, because the consensus, the animosity toward Trump is so extreme at this point. If we're really seeing a racist and nativist kind of model being imposed to exclude immigrants on that basis, essentially, in the United States, wouldn't it be necessary for a Mexican government, perhaps this is a leading question, to take a stronger stance in general against that kind of thing?
I think that the addition of protests about the lack of humanitarianism and the cruelty might have been a useful addendum to the letter to say, look, we have an open mind, we're willing to negotiate with you on these issues. And the letter was AMLO's letter to Trump was very forward-looking and saying we want to have economic development and this is what we're going to do and that'll eventually stop migration. Well, that's a nice thing to say and it's important, but really changing those factors could take a decade. And so what do you do in the meantime? And so it's how do you present sort of a positive, we want to negotiate where we can, at the same time as you're really upset by what they're doing now. I'm not an international diplomat, and I can't claim to put words in the mouths of Mexican government officials, but I know that there was some echo about the letter in the United States where the Mexicans in the US were saying, well, but what about us?
Yeah.
And Mexico's nationalism can be expressed in very positive ways in terms of defense of Mexicans.
And it doesn't have to be exclusionary.
Exactly. And so I'm not sure how things will go. I mean, the other thing to remember from the US side is Trump sort of, he's so erratic in his friendships. I mean, and his idea that foreign policy consists only of the relationships between heads of state with each other is getting him into all sorts of trouble. I mean, he can't tolerate Theresa May or Angela Merkel because he doesn't like women heads of state. So the U.S.'s relationships with Germany and England are subject to his personal predilections. He also had there was this sort of bromance with Trudeau and with Macron. They're these young, good-looking guys, and then he's not friends with them anymore. So I don't blame AMLO for trying to make a positive overture at the beginning, but it's not likely to last once Trump realizes he can't really control what Mexico does. And there's this question of how the millions of Mexicans in the US see their relationship with Mexico.
Yeah, well, I'm not an international diplomat either, but I've been watching this relationship for many, many years, and I don't remember ever seeing a moment that was this delicate in some senses, but also fascinating in terms of kind of resetting the relationship.
Well, we did have optimistic ideas about resetting the relationship with Fox and Bush. Remember, like, they're both, rancheros, and, is there going to be the big enchilada finally, the agreement, and then 9/11 just sunk that. The other thing I know from that period is that when Fox visited Bush on his ranch, the Mexican press wanted a photo of them both on horseback together. Bush doesn't ride, you know? I mean, so the idea that foreign relations are dependent on the personal relationship between two heads of state sometimes can work out in a positive way. Sometimes it's just stupid.
Not likely with Trump.
No, not likely with Trump.
We've come to the end of our time. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll be keeping a close watch on the further developments and hope to have you back soon.
Thank you, Laura.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.